The night may be long and the dark may be deep, but the answers are there to be found. Whether it's the normal, the abnormal, or the paranormal, you're in the right place. Let's go beyond reality.
Welcome to the show. We've got a really terrific show planned for you tonight. Returning guest Tui Snider will be with us to talk about her latest book. It's called 6 Feet Under Texas, which is about weird, bizarre, and famous graves and cemeteries throughout Texas. But we're also going to get into cemeteries in general and some other places around the country that have a similar reputation. So Tui will be with us in just a few moments. Looking forward to that. I will remind you, please subscribe to our channels. We've got a couple for you. One of them is our YouTube channel. If you go to YouTube and you search for J.V. Johnson, you will find the channel pretty easily. And the neat thing about subscribing, first of all, there's no fee. There's no charge to subscribe. But if you do that and you also click the notification icon, you will be alerted whenever we upload new material or we go live. In addition to being notified of those things, you will have the ability to look back on about 500, maybe even 600 now. 600 back episodes of Beyond Reality. Some great interviews there. I often will go back and listen to a guest that I enjoyed a second or third time. It's really because you don't hear it all the first time. In many cases, you're so involved in what's going on with the live program that you'll miss a thing or two, and when you go back and listen, you're like, oh, I didn't hear that the first time. So all those back episodes are available to you on the YouTube channel. We also have a Twitch channel. Twitch channel does not archive the episodes, but it's a lot of fun for the live program because there's a lot of interactivity there. It also has a chat room. And we do our Friday night program on the Twitch channel. And it will not be continuing on the J.V. Johnson YouTube channel for much longer, just so you're all aware of that. So subscribe to both of those channels. Find us on Facebook and just be part of our online community. It's a lot of fun. All right, so we're going to go to break here. We'll get our guest, again, Tui Snider will be with us, returning to the show. Looking forward to this. We're talking about her book called 6 Feet Under, Unique, Famous, and Historic Graves in the Lone Star State. Among other things, we've got a lot of conversation ahead of us. It's Beyond Reality. Looking forward to this night.
Please support the program. Go to patreon.com/Johaw. That's Johaw.
Thanks for joining us tonight. We've got a great show ready for you tonight. We've got returning guest Tui Snider. Now, let's all be honest. How many of you, and I know I put myself into this category, but how many of you likes to take a peaceful walk through the neighborhood or local cemetery? And when you're doing that, you also get very reflective about your life, and you look around and you read the headstones of the people interred there, and maybe you start to wonder, who was that person and what kind of life did they live? Or were they part of a bigger family that was in this community that I live in now? And do I know some of their descendants? These are all things that we ask ourselves, and we actually enjoy the mysteries involved. Well, if that's the case, if you think that way like I think, then Tui Snider is your person, because Tui has written books, including the one we're going to talk about tonight, which is called 6 Feet Under Texas. It is unique, famous, and historic graves in the Lone Star State. Tui, welcome back to Beyond Reality. It's such an honor to have you back here.
Oh, hey, JV. Thanks for having me back. I'm super excited.
So, as I started to do this opening and I started to think about my fascination with cemeteries, and I know many that share it, and I also know that even if you don't have a fascination necessarily with cemeteries, there's nothing more peaceful and calming in many ways than to take a walk through a cemetery. And of course, they're a little bit more quiet than maybe a street might be, but there's something else going on. What is our fascination with cemeteries, do you think?
Well, I think that, when people hear that I spend a lot of time in cemeteries, they react in one of two ways. Either they're like you and they get it, or quite often there's a lot of family members or people I meet for the first time. They hear historic cemetery, they think that I dress like Morticia and I'm obsessed with death. Which I mean I kind of enjoy. I gotta admit, I have some pretty fun kind of goth clothes, but that's not my point. For me, I think the fascination is that it helps connect us with history, with a way that nothing else does, because there you are standing at someone's grave that they put some time and thought into, or their ancestors did. And it just, to me, it just really brings their life story, which, is the most interesting kind of history, because in school I always thought history was the most boring topic. But now, here I do so much historical research all the time, it cracks me up. But I think when you are out there in nature, which gets you thinking reflectively too, and when you're in a cemetery, like you said, it is a little quieter than the street because people do leave you alone. It does create a sort of reverie, and it really does make you think about what it was like to live in other times.
Yeah, it does instill that dose of curiosity, particularly when you start reading the names and maybe some of the other messages that are left on some of these headstones that kind of point to a different way of thinking, maybe a different sense of community. I mean, it just brings it, and this is kind of an oxymoron, but it brings it alive in a very strange way, doesn't it?
It does, and that's why I like to tell people, I say, hey, cemeteries are for the living. And people, they kind of squinch their eyebrows up, like, what are you saying? This is where we put the dead people. But we're really missing the point. One of life's great mysteries is what happens after death. We wonder. We don't know. We're going to find out eventually, but none of us can say 100% certain what happens. But we do have these areas called cemeteries, and they really do exist for us. They're there to comfort the living, and I would argue that they are also there to educate us and to connect us to history. And you mentioned the funny names. I do have to bring up probably my favorite name that I ever saw in a cemetery was Slitha. I still don't know how to pronounce it. It was like Thlitha. But I mean, that got me wondering.
Yeah, and there are a couple of cemeteries around me now. I'm in Cooperstown, New York, and upstate New York still to this day is very rural. So there are these little rural cemetery, these little plots, and you walk through some of these and you see a lot of names like, and I can't pronounce half of them, but things like Ebediah, Ezekiel, or some of these names that we just don't really use as much today. But you have whole cemeteries filled with folks with those names. It was probably either a big family or probably a group of immigrants that moved in a group. But it's telling a story regardless.
And just through their name, just through the simple fact that a name can somehow feel so archaic and foreign to us now, just shows us, it's a little reminder, there'd be so many other things. If we could just travel in time and go back to, 1854, it would be such a foreign world to us in so many ways. Even our name, the name Jake or something, that's kind of an old-fashioned name, but a lot of names would seem like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of modern names, would seem strange to them now. So I think that just something as simple as looking at names is a really great way to connect to history.
And the other thing that you can't help but do is look at, birth and death dates and start to do the math. And realize that it was such a time of, there were a lot of people that died young back in some of these historic cemeteries. And many times you'll see infant graves as well, because I think that the infant mortality rate, in the 19th century was somewhere around 50%. It was pretty high for some parts of the country. And
it was very high.
Yeah, and you look at, and one thing I noticed is a real dichotomy. Either you didn't make it past, let's say, 30, or you live to 80. There's not a lot of in between.
You are so right. And especially with children, those first 5 to 6 years were very precarious. And I do like to go to historic graves because I like graveyards. I like to go to ones where, the most recent grave was like 100 years ago. So everybody there would be dead. And so I'm not thinking about death, I'm thinking about history.
Yeah.
But I got to tell you, when I see a row of children's graves, and especially when, they died from simple things I've looked up, things that are so easily treatable now, like tetanus.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, my gosh. I did a video about the 4th of July, about how, I don't know if you've heard this before, but there was a thing called patriotic lockjaw. And it was because they couldn't treat tetanus yet. Mm-hmm. And how kids, how we are, everybody, 4th of July, everybody sets off fireworks. Well, there was this incredible, thousands of people would die every year. I mean, more, there was newspaper articles about how during a certain time periods, more people died on 4th of July from tetanus, untreated tetanus, than died during the Revolutionary War, things like this. And so, when you walk through the cemetery, it's humbling, and you realize, wow, I just had my tetanus booster shot last year. Thank goodness. It's a horrible way to go.
Yeah, in a time when we're dealing with our own health realities and things we haven't seen in our lifetimes, it's often a little bit sobering to understand that this is almost minor compared to what what our ancestors lived through during the 19th century, when there were no antibiotics. There were no immunizations. There were no hospitals in most places of a rural community. And usually you had to fight it out on your own. And if you were strong enough, you'd survive. And if you weren't, you wouldn't. And it really was a toss-up. In fact, it probably gave the edge to the side of not making it, if anything.
I have got a good epidemic story for you.
Okay.
Not something you usually say, hey, let's talk epidemic stories. But there is a beautiful country cemetery near me, Aurora Cemetery. And in 1892, this epidemic went through and just decimated that poor town. Meanwhile, there was a town 2 miles away, Rome. It's spelled with an H, but anyway, both towns are still there. But anyway, so Rome, meanwhile, had 0 deaths from it. And I read when I was researching the epidemic, it was horrible. Even if you lived through it, there was a good chance you'd be partially paralyzed or blind. It was really nasty. I mean, imagine being blind back then when you're a farmer, and you had, it's just such challenges. So anyway, I was researching this, and it was widely reported in throughout America, this epidemic. It was such a bad, the citizens of Aurora are fleeing, it's this horrible epidemic. Meanwhile, I read letters to the editor from people in Rome bragging, like, hey, over here in Rome, we haven't had a death in the past 5 years. We don't even have a graveyard. We're fine. People move here. They're only 2 miles away, and they were trying to distance themselves from Aurora and the epidemic there. And I thought, wow, talk about a localized tragedy.
Yeah. So when did you start to develop a fascination with, and I just want to be clear for our listeners who may not have heard you on our program before, you don't only write just about cemeteries. You've written a lot of other things as well. But for the sake of our conversation tonight, when did you start having this fascination with cemeteries?
Oh, well, I would have to have been when I was a little girl growing up in Virginia, and next to when I would go to my Girl Scout meetings, we would always, this was back when I was a kid, you'd walked everywhere.
Yeah.
My friends, we'd show up early, and we'd go play in the historic cemetery there. And in fact, we actually, when I was 9, this creepy janitor tried to kidnap me and my friends, and we were able to escape because we could run through that cemetery and make it into the path through the woods before he could catch us. So, I guess it played a big part in my life in that regard. But yeah, I was always fascinated because there were some very old graves there, some very old style ones.
It's pretty interesting to see how things have changed. Now, of course, we don't have the craftsmen as available as maybe they did 100 years ago or 150 years ago. And I think many of our headstones have gotten rather simple. I don't mean that in a derogatory way. They're just simply presented. But then you see some of the older ones with almost artwork all over. It's a real shame because many of those were made out of like just slate or just field stone, and they eroded so rapidly that most of the engravings are gone just from the weather. But the ones that remain, you can still see, there's some designs and there's some images. And I don't mean images of the person who's deceased. I mean just some kind of ornate images. And they put a lot of thought and work into those.
They did, yes. And that is a big difference I noticed from, 100 years ago. If you came into a windfall, you had a bit of money, you would be thinking, if all your other bases were covered, you'd think, what kind of monument can I put at our family plot? But back then, too, families pretty much stayed put. They didn't move all over the way we do now. And there was a big change. What I noticed is the Great Depression made a big, huge change, because once people weren't living close to their loved ones' graves, and they couldn't go back for an annual decoration day, is what they would call it, where they'd have picnics and singing, and they'd tidy the whole graveyard or cemetery. Once people had to move away for work, and if they couldn't make it back to clean up the cemetery, then they became privatized. And so that's when, like, well, let's just have some flat markers that we can plant grass and, run a lawnmower over. And so things really changed. But, I mean, people used to really plan ahead for their headstones. I mean, a lot of times, people in their 20s, if they had some money, and they don't die till they're 60, but they would have created some elaborate, they had a sense of, someone's going to come and remember me. People are going to think, what can I leave? We don't think that way nowadays. Usually, most of my friends who have designed headstones, they've designed something for a loved one who just passed away and hadn't done it themselves. That's
right. Yeah, it's funny. I'm at the age now where, I'm not going to lie, I've thought about that part of the inevitable more than once. And, you mentioned, we don't move around, or we move around a lot more now than we used to. There is something comforting about being, I guess, buried forever with family members and loved ones. And not a lot of people have that luxury anymore.
No, now it's quite rare. I mean, even for people who weren't, super wealthy and couldn't have the big fancy monuments, they would still have, if they could, have some sort of plot somewhere, people where they could, the locals, we all just have a common cemetery. Everybody kind of gets buried here. You knew you would be with your family then.
It's interesting. You made a quote that I actually got a chuckle out of, and I saw it on your website. You say I used to write fiction, but then I moved to Texas. Tell me about that. Tell me about that quote.
Oh my gosh, that is so true. Oh, well, yeah. I mean, I used to write sci-fi and whatever. Really stretch my imagination, try to come up with weird stories and strange characters and scenarios. But then I moved to Texas. I mean, a really great example of this would have to be the Aurora space alien grave, which, did we talk about this at all last time?
I think we did, but it is
it
is well worth repeating, because it is such an amazing story and kind of an oddity right there in Texas. You need to tell the story again.
I will tell it, and since you mentioned it, this explains like how I used to write fiction, and and now then I moved to Texas. I was at a barbecue and met somebody, and they just said, hey, I hear you're a writer. And I'm like, yeah. And they said, well, you know what you should write? And I mean, usually this is, in my earlier life, when I lived up north, this would usually be followed by some really boring tale or something. I'm like, why don't you write that if you're so passionate about it? But this person goes, you ought to write about that little space alien they buried down the road a piece. And I'm like, what? What did you just say? Are you pulling my leg?
And you hadn't heard of that story until that moment?
No, I had not. Which is
so
weird.
That must have been a real shock.
Grandma lived near Roswell, and I've been pretty fascinated by UFOs since I was a kid. But yeah, I hadn't. So I really was like, what? You are lying. You're just, I'm new. You're just going to tell me something ridiculous. But yeah, no, I went and I looked, and not only was there this one spacecraft, so there was, let me back up, because I looked into it, and in 1897, a newspaper, Dallas News, reported that there was a cigar-shaped craft that didn't just crash, it exploded. It didn't just explode. The locals found a charred little body in it that was, quote unquote, not an inhabitant of this world. I love that line. That was really did me in. I was like, what? And so it was the day before Easter. And as you did when a stranger comes through town, I have several examples of strangers coming through town and dying, and how the locals will be like, I will give them a nice burial. That's what they did to this little alien. Not knowing what it was, they put it in a child-sized coffin, and they buried it in Aurora Cemetery. And it is so crazy. So here's where it gets even weirder. Like, I thought that, doesn't that seem plenty weird? I'm satisfied with the weirdness aspect, but no, It just gets weirder. Because when I do research, I want to get my own information on it. I don't want to just take what people are saying now. So I try to go back as close as I can to the source. And so I dug around in newspaper archives, and, I just innocently typed the word 1897 and airship in, and I got hundreds of responses. And then that's when what was new to me was that there had been hundreds of airships sightings reported in 1897 in Texas. And so that has just been this ongoing research project that I just, a book, hopefully the book will come out next spring. I've been working on it for quite a while. It's just a crazy, crazy tale.
Is that the book, The Great Texas Airship Mystery of 1897?
Yes. I gave a talk about it at the International UFO Congress last year, and that's when I realized, when I was preparing for that talk, I realized that I had enough material for like a 4-hour talk. I was like, holy moly, let's just make a book already. It's just one of those ones that I never feel satisfied with the research I do. You hit a point with research where you're like, well, I've got enough, I could move on. But that alien one, it's just like, it's just nutty.
Yeah, so just so I understand, so when you found out about the alien grave, which I want to talk a little bit more about in a second here, and then you did some more research, you uncovered these airship sightings. Are you connecting the two?
Oh yeah, this was one of the airship sightings. Yeah, this one was just one of them. There's a period of time, and I haven't really honed it down, but especially March, April, May, there were just a glut of them in Texas, all throughout Texas. But what's interesting, and they were actually airship sightings in 1897. And just to be clear, I mean, the biggest thing flying in the sky at that time in America should have been a vulture. I mean, there was not controlled manned flight or whatever alien.
Did they have hot air balloons at that point?
They did.
Yeah.
The Montgolfier brothers in France had created those like in 1783, I think.
Right.
So those have been around, but they were in the Civil War. The Union forces had gone up in a balloon so that they could do some recon and spy on the Confederates. But the thing is, you could go up in a balloon, but it was not controlled craft. You went up, you looked around, you came down. It's not like the Wright brothers. They went up and they actually controlled and flew. So that, there were not, even the balloons that they had were not very controlled at that time. I mean, so what people were describing in this 1897 period wasn't something that really should have been existing at that point. And what's really weird to me is it started actually in the fall of 1896, these sightings over on the West Coast in the San Francisco area, and then they work their way across, and then they show up in Texas, and then they start to, and there's some scattered throughout America, but then it's like it was going from west to east. That was one of the things that really got me about it. I mean, my feelings are all over about it. I don't claim to know the definitive answer, but I want to know what was reported. So I just keep digging and digging.
I'm fascinated by the story, and I'm particularly fascinated by the alien grave. Getting back to that part of the discussion here, you read newspaper reports of this. Did you find any eyewitness accounts of the burial and what was placed in the coffin, descriptions, or did that not exist?
That drives me nuts. I haven't. I've only gotten secondhand descriptions that yes, it was buried immediately. I haven't gotten a really satisfying description of the burial. Now there was supposedly some strange material with it. It was buried with some bits of metal. It was buried, that were found around it, and some sort of paper that had, what they described as some strange writing in it. Hieroglyphics, they called it. It wasn't like Egyptian, but, just some strange writing that wasn't a recognized alphabet, which I'm just dying to see. But what's weird about it now, a lot of people say, like, well, obviously this is a bunch of malarkey because they didn't go all CSI and, dismantle the body. But, that you just didn't do that in 1897. There was a real stigma against an autopsy. Even if your husband or wife died mysteriously, the thought of defiling their body with an autopsy was just not in their mindset of 1897. Their mindset was more, you wanted to be buried and given a good Christian burial. So
yeah, and that was
there's a lot to it.
That was going to be my next question. Did they give this mysterious body a Christian burial? Because often, if you couldn't weren't known to have been baptized and have been Christian, they wouldn't even put you in the same cemetery as those who were.
Yeah, if they knew what you were, they would put you there. But I think where it's buried is kind of the Masonic section, which is just the Masons would let a lot of people bury their dead there. So I had tried to figure that out. I don't know. I really don't know who. I would like to know who officiated, if there was a minister involved, or how many people were there. I haven't had a satisfying description of that. I mean, the little town of Aurora had gone through a lot. That's where they had that epidemic where recently, and they had a fire, and they'd had a blight, and they'd had pretty much, it was like biblical proportions badness in that little town. So I think it was kind of like, oh, now we got an alien, whatever, let's just bury it.
I'm just so curious, and has anybody ever tried to exhume that body?
Oh, yes. So in 1973, the guy who was the head of MUFON in Texas, and he also happened to write for Bill Case, was his name. He wrote some articles about it. And his buddy Jim Mars also wrote. He wrote, Jim's great. I got to meet him. He really was the reigning expert. And I talked to him about it, which was super helpful. So this is 1973. There's a big gap from 1897 to 1973 where the story just sort of faded into oblivion, and people just sort of forgot about it. It wasn't spoken of. But this guy, Bill Case and Jim Mars, they brought it up. And so once they published those articles, it really, those articles got picked up and spread around, and, kind of went viral as you could go in 1973. And so lots of people came to this little town of Aurora, which currently has a population of about 400, and they were not thrilled by all the people tramping around in their little, country burial ground. And so they got the cops there and had them keeping track of it 24/7. They had a vigil, for 2 weeks solid. They were there. The very day that they quit, someone came, and the original headstone just disappeared. The original headstone was this kind of cool looking rock, a rugged rock, but it had a little cigar shaped craft on it with portholes drilled on it, and which is really neat. But even worse, so I talked about Jim Mars and Bill Case. They came back, and not only was a headstone missing, but when they ran a metal detector over the plot again, it no longer picked up evidence of metal that it had. They had gone over there where the alien was buried, and they were picking up some sort of metal, which, people did say there were reports that it had metal had been put in the coffin with it. And then they noticed these 3 weird holes that were kind of drilled into the ground, because the ground, from when I spoke to Jim, he made it sound like, the ground didn't particularly look disturbed. It was like someone had surreptitiously, I'm envisioning using some sort of device to kind of, scrape the grass off, lift up, dig the thing out, and then put it back and try and make it look like nothing was there. So super disappointing. Meanwhile, this whole time they were asking the Cemetery Association, you have to get a court order before you can exhume anyone.
Right.
And they, I've heard some people say that, they wouldn't allow it because you have to contact next of kin, hardy har. But really it was just, they wouldn't they wouldn't allow it to happen. So even as of today, I wish they would,
Well, it would certainly answer a few questions, wouldn't it?
It really, really would. And, it is interesting because, I started looking into this in 2012, and even back then, the locals were pretty tight-lipped about it. But by 2016, something shifted, and now Aurora, if you go to their, aurora.gov or whatever their official website is, you'll see they've incorporated an alien into their logo, and now it says Aurora, a legendary Texas town. And they have, when you drive into town, which, driving into Aurora and driving out of Aurora is one of those, don't blink kind of towns.
Right.
They have this neat little windmill. and a spaceship and like a half crashed spaceship there and a little cutout of an alien. I mean, they're my point is now they're kind of into it. They're like, hey, this is a neat part of our history. Whereas, like as recently as 2012, people were like, we don't want to talk about that.
That's an interesting point, because places like Salem, Massachusetts went through the same metamorphosis where they disavowed their past. They thought it was an ugly past. They didn't want to recognize it. And now they embrace it fully. Not that they condone what happened, but they understand the history of what happened, helps teach people about, the old saying, learn history or you're doomed to repeat it kind of thing.
Yes.
And a lot of places around the country are starting to embrace these more macabre or strange parts of their history, and they're finding some real pleasure in doing that. And I'm glad, as somebody who enjoys these things, that they're doing that.
Yeah, it is so important. And, this is an interesting one, but even when something bad has happened in your town, like I wrote a book about this guy who dressed as a Santa Claus bank robber, and, because one of the biggest manhunts in Texas was for Santa. I mean, like I'm telling you, and then they end up lynching Santa. Like I said, I used to write fiction, like you pointed out. But my point was I was talking to different historians, and I wanted to get information about the lynching. And the historians, I could not find a historian in the local area who would talk to me about that. They would just be like, let's talk about our other neat things that happened. We don't want to dwell on that, and we don't want to condone that. I'm like, we're not condoning it. We're showing that by talking about a lynching, it really illustrates that this is a big reason that we have a good, intact legal system. That's why we have law enforcement agents. We don't. So, ironically, I finally got the local sheriff to talk to me about it. It turns out he's a history buff, and he had all sorts of great information. So it is. I'm totally with you. People shouldn't hide their history. You don't have to be proud of everything that happened in your area, but we need to learn from it.
We do need to learn from it, and I think some of these stranger parts of local history that are parts of legends and lore for local areas, they just develop. They give that area, whatever it happens to be, a character that they might not have otherwise. I think it's a really important part of tradition and history for those areas. So I'm glad they're doing it. Let's talk a little bit about the reason you decided to write this book. Obviously, you started to look around. Again, it's called 6 Feet Under Texas. You started to look around. You started to see these, stories, and then did you match the graves to the stories, or did you find the graves first and then research who these people were and discover the stories? Which one came first?
Well, it was actually gonna be a small chapter in my book that's about cemetery symbols, because I wrote a book called Understanding Cemetery Symbols, which explains what the different things mean on headstones. Well, why is there an upside down torch, or what does a pentacle actually mean? Was grandma a witch? No, stuff like that. But my editor said, this is, and I was having a hard time like making that chapter small. And my editor said, this is another book. So I pulled it aside, and I've just been, it's one of those projects that's been backburnered for a while. But I thought this is the year for it, because visiting historic cemeteries right now during a pandemic is a really fun activity that gets you out of the house. It's easy to practice social distancing, and, it could be a great way to learn some history and fun. So that's really why I felt like, this is the year for this book.
Yeah, it is the year for this book. It's the year for people to start actually opening books and start delving into some of these things again. I think we got so busy for there. At least I know myself that other than stuff I needed to read for the show, I was kind of just too busy to do anything else. And this has helped me rediscover my love for reading, and particularly things that I just have a personal interest in, like this. Tell me about, there's so many stories in the book, but there are a few that stood out to me that I'm really anxious to hear you tell this particular audience. But the story of, is it Maureen Johnson Johnson?
Oh, I absolutely am enchanted by this woman.
Yeah.
Yes, Maureen Johnson Johnson. And, she really does go by, or went by, Johnson Johnson. And her friends would tease her that she had to have a hyphenated name because a single Johnson couldn't possibly achieve as much as she did. She was a very busy woman. She was an opera singer. She'd been in World War II. She was a WAC And she even she was the first postmistress, as they used to call them, back in 1957 in Eastland, Texas. And she just was so, I don't know, she was such a dynamo. She's one of those people where I wish I could have met her. She, like, one of the first things she did was she got rid of all the spittoons inside, and she put, like, potted plants inside her. Can you imagine spittoons in a post office now? But back then, she made a sculpture of a lion out of an old tailpipe and put it in the front of the post office. She made, like, used petunias to make a flag, like red, white, and blue petunias to make a big old 30-foot like flag, garden-themed thing. But the thing that is really amazing about her is she just took it on herself, and she asked permission first from, the highest in the chain of command at the post office if she could make a mural out of postage stamps. And what she did, she ended up making this mural that you can see for free if you go to Eastland and just go to their post office. And I should say that I have like 50 chapters in the book, and it makes great armchair travel. I like to say, like, my books will take you places. It might just be time travel, historical, or you could actually go there. Because, like, if you live, realize, hey, I'm going to be going through Eastland, I have the address where you can go to their post office and see it for yourself. It's like a 6 by 10 foot mural made of thousands of, like, over 11,000 postage stamps. And not only, and it's really beautiful. You got to see, I have pictures in my book, but she made this design that is like, it's really neat. It has a picture like a Ben Franklin stamp, like a 5-cent stamp, but it's made out of Ben Franklin stamps. Mm-hmm. I'm not describing it very well, but it's just amazing. Meticulous, took her years. She actually got help from the Smithsonian Institute as far as how to treat the stamps so they'll be of archival quality. But to top it off, she wrote letters to everyone in the United Nations and to presidents, and she asked them, hey, what's your favorite stamp? She'd send them a stamp and say, this is my favorite stamp. What's yours? And could you please sign it and send it back? So her mural actually has the signatures of 6 presidents. Like, she's got Richard Nixon, Lyndon Johnson, John F. Kennedy, I think Harry Truman.
Wow.
Yeah. And you can just go and see this. It's still there. Now, the weird thing about her, so she did this amazing piece of work. And a lot of, I kind of think of this as overlooked history because I've met people who live in Eastland and don't know about this. And I think, oh my goodness, this is something, like you were saying, we need to celebrate our local history and the quirky things. She is someone that more should be known about. I think if I kept digging, you could write a whole book about her. But one of the weirder things about her, which I don't quite get, is that when she died, she actually wanted to be buried perpendicular to her husband. And you probably know, a lot of times, like if I'm in a cemetery and I notice a grave that's way off by itself or at a different angle than everybody else, if there's all of them are facing west, but then I suddenly notice one that's facing north, I'm curious, like, why is that?
Right.
They will do that sometimes with outlaws or someone, sort of a way to, like, you're not one of us, kind of to ostracize them in death. But in her case, she wanted to be buried perpendicular to her husband, and I have a photo in the book, because she wanted to be buried at his feet because I will always, to serve him in the afterlife, I will always be his servant. I was like, wow. Not a women's liber, apparently.
Yeah. So just because I have to ask, her name, last name Johnson-Johnson was because she felt it was important to have it twice?
Well, that's what her friends joked. I don't know why she hyphened it. That is a good point. I mean, it was just always hyphened.
I had assumed when I saw the name, I thought, well, maybe her last name was Johnson and she married a Johnson, unrelated.
She was. Yeah, she was. Mm-hmm. She married a Johnson. So it's interesting because on the one, it seems so interesting.
It would have been the same.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. It's one of those things I would have really liked to heard it from her mouth, why she did that.
That's funny. There's another one that immediately caught my attention, and I know you have favorites as well. But the story of it's Karen Silkwood, and the reason that caught my attention is because I remember there was a movie with that name, and I wasn't sure if there was a connection until I read the story and realized there was. Tell us the story about Karen Silkwood.
Yeah, and you know what? I had never seen the movie. That was one of the things I did for research. I think it's a really great movie, by the way, and I looked it up, and I saw that the people, since it was a biopic, the people who, and it has Meryl Streep in it, and it has Cher in it. Cher is great. And everyone who was represented in the movie, I read an interview where they were commenting on it and saying that, yeah, they did a good job. I think, who wouldn't want to be played by Cher or Meryl Streep anyway? I mean, it's not the most glamorous job because, here, I'll get into it. Karen Silkwood, now, she grew up in Texas, but she went through a pretty painful divorce, and so she moved to Oklahoma, and a friend there said, hey, there's a job over at this nuclear power plant. You could probably work there. Now, Karen Silkwood had always been smart and really liked science, and so the job seemed really interesting. She was, involved in, they were working with plutonium pellets. So plutonium is super duper toxic, and she started to notice that, there were some health and safety issues going on, and the bigger-ups, the big wigs at the nuclear plant were kind of smoothing it over, being like, oh, yeah, just rinse yourself off. Oh, you got dosed a little. Oh, well, just, scrub you down. Well, you don't have to be exposed to much plutonium at all to be guaranteed that you're going to have cancer. And she and her friends actually got tested at one point, and they all learned that they, were, especially her, were going to get cancer. Uh-huh. And so, yeah. And so, as she got more and more upset about this, she kept complaining. And she was also worried that, she also discovered, this was really frightening too, she discovered that someone was messing around with the quality control records. And so she thought, if our nuclear plant passes along some of these faulty fuel rods, it could cause a meltdown. There could be a Chernobyl, or it could be a big explosion. So she was understandably very nervous. So she joined the union, and she ended up, she actually testified in front of the Atomic Energy Commission, and she started kind of doing her own, her own little research. She was just keeping track, trying to find out what was going on. Now, people knew she was doing this research, even though she was trying to be surreptitious about it. And so things get weirder and weirder. I'm condensing a lot because there's been books written about this, which I have, and it's really elaborate. But for the sake of the book, and one thing I did in the book too is when something was a very complicated thing like this as well, I do include a for further reading section. Like if any of these chapters really capture your imagination, you want to learn more about them, more power to you, because there have been books and movies about it. But long story short, on the night that she was set to meet with someone and be a whistleblower and, hand over some information that she had gotten, she had this manila envelope with her that people saw. And she was like, I have some pretty, damning evidence in here that I'm going to hand over to a New York Times reporter and a union official. And so as she was driving on that way, her car went off the road and she died in the crash. And they tested her blood, and they were like, okay, she had alcohol and quaaludes in her bloodstream, case closed. But an independent, investigator hired by her family discovered that this was not a single car accident. There was evidence that her vehicle had been bumped and run off the road. So it's a very chilling account, and it's just someone really paying the price, the ultimate price for being trying to be a whistleblower, trying to thinking of the safety of others. And,
I can't imagine. I can't imagine. You probably didn't stop with your research there. You probably, when you started to recognize the abnormalities of the story and the inconsistencies, you probably have I bet you have a notepad somewhere that says to look into this further, because that's an amazing story, and it's one that I'd never heard. About the details of the mystery surrounding all of this.
Yeah, I would tell anybody who's interested in it, a great place to start with the movie, Silkwood. Because I wasn't going to mention the movie because sometimes movies are made, and, as someone who does a lot of historic research, I just end up, my head hurts from rolling my eyes so much. They skew the facts so much. this one actually was good. And like I even, saw interviews where the people depicted were like, yeah, this is an accurate depiction. So, which isn't always the case with quote unquote history movies. I don't want to watch them if they distort it. So yeah, this story was so sad. I mean, she was only 28.
Yeah, so young.
And she was so passionate and really cared and wanted to do something right and was trying to, right some wrongs, but she ran into all sorts of stuff, just unfair, and just died young.
One of the things, we'll tell this next one, and then we've got to take a quick break, but one of the things that I always find fascinating when I have discussions about the paranormal, especially when we talk about ghostly activity, I'll ask somebody who investigates ghosts, how they got their interest or when did they have their first experience. And frequently, above any other place that's mentioned, is the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, which has obviously a Civil War connection. And obviously, it was the site of the bloodiest battle in American history. Over 55,000 men were either killed or wounded. The land around Gettysburg is soaked in blood, so you can understand why there'd be so much paranormal activity there. But one of the stories in your book that grabbed me because of the Civil War connection is the story about the German immigrants that were trying to not be part of the Confederate Army because Texas had seceded from the Union and was joining the Confederacy and was forcing all their able-bodied men to go to war. Tell the story, because it's awfully tragic, but the good news is they've been honored in, I think, a very just way after the fact.
Yeah, so this is down in Comfort, Texas, and this is a story where my book was about to go to press, and I discovered that I actually have a family connection to this. So my book is actually dedicated to these people. But one thing about the Civil War that I think gets overlooked a lot is that when states seceded, it wasn't always a cut and dry decision. It wasn't like, when Texas seceded in 1861, it wasn't like every single Texan said, okay, let's secede from the Union. There were actually a lot of German settlers here in Texas. So you can still feel the effects of German culture here. We have lots of great German restaurants, for instance, especially down in the hill country. That's where where the German settlers came through in the 1800s. So these people had some, when we think of people immigrating, we tend to think of Staten Island, and we don't think about the fact that Galveston was a really great doorway to America as well. So people's life, entry into America could have happened there as well. And in fact, this is really kind of cool too. Texas has its own sub-dialect of German that brought here, and it still exists to this day, and people are studying it because it's dying out. But anyway, all these Germans who had come to America and had recently taken an oath of allegiance to the Union were not really feeling it when they were told to secede. They were like, we are Treue der Union. I'm probably butchering that, but that means, I don't speak German, but that means loyal to the Union. And so they were like, hey, we don't want to be forced to fight for something we don't believe in. For one thing, a lot of them did not believe in slavery as well. And so it put them in a bad position. Well, lucky for them, the governor said, hey, I'm making a proclamation. You guys have a month. You have 30 days. Anybody who doesn't want to fight for the Confederate Army, I'm giving you a little time to just clear out. I'm giving you 30 days. So in August of 1862, there was this group of men, and they met kind of down by Kerrville, and they, elected the leader. They had a plan. Like, we're going to ride into Mexico. We're going to sail north, and then I think to New Orleans, and they were going to hook up with some Union forces. That was their plan. And since they had a month, they thought, we don't have to race. We can kind of take our time. We don't have to find strategic positions to camp. We can kind of camp out in the open and make sure our horses are watered, and we can do a little hunting along the way. So they were doing this, I would call it leisurely too much. It wasn't like a camping trip, but they weren't forcing themselves to march and making their horses work really hard. They were like, we got time. But about, a few days in, some of the men noticed they were feeling uneasy. Some of the lookouts were like, hey, we think we're being followed and we might get attacked. And some of them turned away, like about 30 of them left. But the rest of them remained, and sadly, they were ganged up upon by a group of rogue Confederate soldiers. There was a guy, Captain James Duff, and he had some very well-armed men. He outnumbered them considerably. Like, he had 125 men. They only had about 40 left. And he attacked them at the Nueces River at dawn. So sometimes this is called the Nueces River Massacre. And to top it off, after Duff and his troops just slaughtered as many of the men as they could, the ones that were wounded, rather than take them captive, which was the tradition, what you were supposed to do, he went through and just made, he told his men, shoot them, make sure they're all dead, or, if they're on their way out, just leave them to die. And they did not bury them, which was a huge slight as well. Just leave their bodies to rot. So about 17 men made it away. And after the war, they went back and they retrieved those bleached bones, as they were described, and they took them back, and it didn't take them very long. Like, the war ended in 1865. By 1866, they'd erected this really impressive obelisk, and they have a memorial there. They have an American flag there that is permanently at half-mast. And one thing is kind of cool about it, it only has 36 stars on it, because that's how many states there were in the Union as of 1865. So, yeah, it's pretty incredible. And I was really shocked. So my mom was talking to me, and she said, "Oh, honey, you're doing a book about unique graves in Texas. Did you do anything about that Nueces River Massacre?" And I'm like, "What? Yeah." She goes, "Oh, well, those were some of those were our ancestors." And I'm like, "What?" So I haven't yet found the names exactly of who, but I didn't realize I had that connection to the book. So yeah, obviously I'm gonna keep researching that one.
Yeah, that's interesting. But the Civil War actually shows up in a bunch of these stories.
It does. And it wasn't intentional. I'm not someone, like, I lived in Virginia till I was 10, and like, I was sick of the Civil War by then.
Sure.
There was a playground fight over the Civil War. I was like, really, people, come on. But as you mentioned, there was such a huge loss. When I give presentations, I love to just I like to show a graph of showing all the deaths from all the conflict, and I don't have to say anything. I'm like, take a look at this. I don't have to toss any numbers out. Here's how many people died in every conflict in American history. Look at the Civil War. It was just such a, I just think the entire country was grieving. I mean, everyone must have experienced, every family must have been affected. And it affected the way we treat the dead. I mean, suddenly embalming techniques needed to be improved because soldiers needed to be transported home, and caskets started to be mass-produced, and before they'd mostly been made by, you might have made your own, or you would get them locally. So just things, it really did impact things. So when you start studying historic cemeteries here, you're going to bump into the Civil War.
Well, there was so much loss, as you mentioned. Everyone was touched by loss, both sides of the war. I mean, usually you've got, we're on one side and the other side's the enemy. And when we count casualties, we basically are concerned with our own. But in this particular case, both sides were American. So every casualty was an American casualty. Everybody was touched. And also, one of the things you probably know and certainly found in your research is that after the Civil War, people started to look for ways to connect to those people they lost. You have to remember, most people didn't have photographs of the loved ones they lost. When they left to go to war, that was the last time they ever saw them and the last time they will ever see them. And in many cases, the images of what they even looked like would fade. So there was a desperate cry of people trying to reach loved ones that they had lost, and that kind of gave rise to the spiritual movement. Yes,
and actually people's attitude towards it definitely did. I mean, everyone had been touched by death. Everyone wondered, and people say, well, why did we, Queen Victoria's mourning practices after she lost her beloved Prince Albert, we adopted a lot of her practices here across the pond, but we needed something. We needed, that elaborate grief. We needed something, a way to express that. But I definitely can see the connection between the Civil War and spiritualism.
Tonight we're talking with Tui Snider, returning guest to the program, about her new book. It's called 6 Feet Under Texas. We're talking about unique, famous, and historic graves in the Lone Star State, among other things. Tui, when did you set out to write the book, and how long did it take?
Oh, that's hard to say, really, because every time I'm researching one thing, I do a lot of newspaper research. So, when I do, I set a timer for 20 minutes because when that dings, I need to look and see, oh, am I still staying on topic or have I gotten off topic? Like I get distracted by, interesting stories that I see in the headlines. So I have so many feelers out all the time and so many projects going. I did get serious about the book and start putting it into a document probably in May of this year. But that said, I had done the research on these places, over the past really 10 years.
The list of stories is long. You've got a lot of really cool stuff there. And what I really liked what you did is you made every one of them personal. You told the story of the person that was interred there, why it's important, plus the uniqueness of the grave itself. Tell me about Bonnie and Clyde's bodies. Are they buried in Texas? You talk about this, don't you?
Yes, I do. And once again, a lot of it, like Karen Silkwood, this is another case where Bonnie and Clyde are so infamous. And one thing that gets me about them is, they were criminals. They were nasty people. Yeah. And yet, they've been elevated to the status of folk hero. And it's interesting to me when that happens because some criminals, we just see them as criminals and others don't. And I think in part of why we see them, part of why we see them as folk heroes might be because Bonnie was so good at branding them. She would send poems and photos to newspapers, and if she were happening now, she'd have an Instagram account or something, But and I do laugh because nowadays, I do a lot of travel writing too, and quite often when I'm at a historic hotel, they want to tell me that, and among our famous clientele, it was Bonnie and Clyde, and I don't know, it seems impossible, or else they are just, I joke that I'm going to write the Bonnie and Clyde travel guide sometime. But they became folk legends or folk stars or something. I'm not even sure. They just developed their own cult following, it seems. Yeah, but it all came to an end in 1934 when they were ambushed by law enforcement agents. And one of the quotes I got for the book, I got it from the paper that came out that day or the next day. And I really like to do that. I don't like to use modern sources. I like to go back as much as I can because I think even the phrasing, the way they would phrase words, can say a lot too. So I got a quote from the Texas Ranger, Frank Hamer, who's very famous, and he was quoted in the papers as saying, I hated to bust a cap on a woman, especially when she was sitting down. However, if it hadn't been her, it would have been us. And I thought it was interesting because even in 1934, there was still that, that kind of a feeling of like you would never shoot a woman, you would never hit a woman. It just shows a different, and just his way. I hated to bust a cap on a woman. I thought that sounds so gangstery in a way, but he's the law enforcement agent. But it was pretty horrid. It must have been a really horrifying sight because they were ambushed and the law enforcement agents, they emptied their guns on them and they had at least 50 bullets in each body. Now, nowadays, if someone is killed, we assume their next stop for the body is going to be a funeral home.
Right.
But Bonnie and Clyde's bodies were taken to a furniture store in Arcadia, Louisiana. And we think, well, that must have been kind of weird. But no, for the time period, that actually made perfect sense. Oh, yeah, a little town might not have a funeral home for that kind of, nearby or whatever. Furniture stores actually kind of their side hustle quite often was to be a morgue. Because they would, furniture stores, and then another side hustle would be, and we build caskets. Right. We'll store the body, we'll build the casket. So it's something we've kind of forgotten in our modern era. So I thought that was interesting. I like to kind of include things that are very of the era. Now, what happened? I felt sorry for that furniture store because people somehow word got out that Bonnie and Clyde, the infamous Bonnie and Clyde's bodies, were there, and they couldn't do anything about it. A stampede of people came through. I mean, doors were ripped off hinges. Furniture was trashed. Everyone wanted to get a look at their bodies. They were then transferred from Louisiana. They were taken that night by ambulance. and they were taken to separate funeral homes, and they tried to keep it a secret. But, the same thing happened. Just people, a throng, like a game, overwhelmed everybody and, trashed the places because, they were just so famous.
Right. Yeah, everybody wanted to get a glimpse of them, and I can't imagine they were in any shape to be viewed. I mean, with 50 bullets in each body. Yikes.
It must have been horrifying, yeah.
What about the two men that were chained together in death? Were they buried together, and what's their story about?
Oh, I love this story. This one is so interesting. This is over in East Texas, a town called Jefferson, which is just a delightful, historic town. It still has a lot of old buildings up, and when you walk the streets of Jefferson, you really feel like you're walking back in time. But back in the 1870s, there were a couple men living there. There's Jesse Robinson and Bill Rose, and these two guys were just the worst badasses in town. They were known to be terrible. Like the local newspaper once described them as dangerous and bad men, either drunk or sober. And so no good church-going folks wanted to be seen in their company. So as far as friends went, Mr. Rose and Mr. Robinson, they just had each other. And I kind of like to describe them as frenemies because no one else would hang out with them, but so they would hang out with each other. And what happened is they ended up killing each other over the stupidest thing ever. One of them invited the other for a drink, and he declined. And he said, you know what, drinking doesn't bring out the best in me. I don't feel like drinking today. Well, the other one got all offended, went home, came back with a gun. They shot each other. And, it's like, I guess drinking doesn't bring the best out in either of them, drunk or sober, like the newspaper said. And so the locals, this is one of the weirdest graves I have ever seen, quite frankly. Now, legend has it that their coffins have chains between them, like they're in separate coffins, but they're chained together. I have not gone over with, a metal detector or ground-penetrating radar. But what they do have, and if anyone wants to see this, they can go to my website or buy the book. But they have these two iron, they look like wood. They're meant to look like two wood poles, and they're covered with, each pole has ivy around it, engraved around it. Now, ivy in cemetery symbolism stands for friendship. So there's two poles, and then there's a chain going between them. So it's like they have this friendship, but they're chained together through their bad decisions, I guess. I mean, it is just one of the most interesting, strange, and very fitting, very creative grave.
What was your favorite? Remember, it might be hard to narrow it down to one.
Yeah.
So pick one for now. Maybe we'll have time for another one. But when you were researching and hearing these stories and learning about these people that have been buried in these places, what made your top of your list?
Oh my gosh! Well, I do have to say one of my favorites is the rope walker mystery, because there's a man buried in Corsicana, Texas, and all it says on his headstone is Rope Walker, 1884. And while I was digging around in some newspaper archives, I pieced together a story, and I was able to find out his actual name, which no one has known. It was a case of, this is one thing I think is so interesting is, today we just take it for granted that everyone carries ID. And if they don't have ID, we could do dental records or DNA or look at CCTV. I mean, when you have none of that and you are traveling even 40 miles away from your hometown and you die, you might never be known. So that's what happened. This guy came to town and he was a tightrope walker. Well, he was actually, first and foremost, he was selling wood stoves. But he decided to get attention, he would go to the busiest part of town, he'd string a line between two tall buildings, and he would do his tightrope walking between the two. Now, to top it off, he put a wood stove on his back, and as if that wasn't enough, he was one-legged. So
wow.
He had a little notch. I know, it's just the craziest tale. So this guy, talk about a great sense of balance. So he was about halfway across when the iron bar that he tied his rope to broke off, and he tumbled to the ground, and his stove landed on his good leg, and they had to amputate it. And before he could recover or really come to, he died. He was able to tell them that he was Jewish, and so they did bury him in the Hebrew cemetery, but it's remained a mystery. And if you read the book, pieced it together, and I found his stage name, and then I found his real name, and I was so excited. So I would have to say that is one of my favorites.
That's really interesting for sure. You also wrote about a person buried in a Kiss, as in the band Kiss, casket with an Eddie Van Halen guitar. What is this about?
I know. Okay, I almost mentioned this one because I do like, So, the band Kiss, they talk about merchandise. Most bands will have T-shirts and maybe they'll have posters,
right.
Maybe a coffee mug or something. Well, the band Kiss, they also have what they call a Kiss casket, and they spell casket with a K. And it's if you're a big fan of, you can look it up online and Google Kiss casket, and you'll see what we're talking about. It's for real. Well, there was a band called Pantera, and their lead guitarist was known as Dimebag Darrell. And back in 2004, this crazy idiot jumped onto the stage and just shot Dimebag in the head.
I remember that.
Several times. Yeah, it was horrifying. I mean, and it just, So he died instantly, and the guy who shot him was, caught and killed shortly after. So no one, it was just one of those senseless, horrifying things. But Dimebag had been really inspired by Van Halen. And, shortly before his death, he actually got the chance to meet Eddie Van Halen, and they really hit it off. I mean, his guitar playing was very influenced by Eddie Van Halen, and when they met, they just really, clicked, connected in the way that two people with a real common, common talent can. And Dimebag said he wanted to buy a guitar from Eddie Van Halen. There's one that's known as his Bumblebee guitar. It's a black guitar, but it has yellow and black stripes on it.
Mm-hmm.
And so Eddie Van Halen, just without being asked, he showed up to the memorial service for Dimebag Darrell, and he handed over his actual Bumblebee guitar, and he told Dimebag's, life partner that, hey, Dime was an original, and, an original should have an original. Here, give him this. And so he is buried with his idol's guitar, and it's really cool.
Wow. What about Lee Harvey Oswald's grave? First of all, is that accessible to the public? And secondly, you mentioned there's an empty grave with a headstone that reads Nick Beef next to that grave.
Yeah, this is such a strange one, too. So, when we all know that November 1963 was not a good time in Dallas.
Right.
Kennedy was assassinated, and shortly after, Lee Harvey Oswald was shot. And maybe because of things that had happened with Bonnie and Clyde, when he was shot, no funeral home would take his body. Maybe they were thinking, like, we know what happened when Bonnie and Clyde died. People stormed our funeral homes. So they carefully transported him over to Fort Worth, which is about 30 miles away, and they used a pseudonym, and they buried him, and very secretively. Like they did the best they could because they didn't want to have a riot. Now, his headstone is one of those ones we were talking about earlier, just like a little flat, rectangular, almost looks like a brick. All it says is Oswald. It doesn't have his birth date, his death date. It doesn't have his first, just to say Oswald is enough. Now, there is an empty plot on either side of him, or there was. When his mother passed away, she was buried in one, and there's nothing there. It doesn't say Oswald or Mrs., Mom or anything on it. It's blank. But in 1997, one that looks kind of like Oswald's appeared, and it says Nick Beef on it. And, you can imagine there's already enough conspiracy theories going on surrounding this whole thing. So when Nick Beef appeared, people were saying all sorts of things about it. And one thing that kept coming up for me, people kept telling me that, a local historian bought that so that you can go and ask them at the cemetery, where is Nick Beef's grave? And they will direct you to it because they won't tell you where Oswald's grave is. But that didn't quite ring true to me. That just wasn't working. When I had spoken to, I have some friends who actually work in the funeral business around here and make monuments and stuff. And they were like, they don't tell you where anybody's grave is at that particular cemetery. They were like, it's not like they're not telling you where Oswald's is. They won't tell you where anybody's is. So, because every cemetery has a different policy on that, sometimes I'm trying to find My big tip for people is talk to a caretaker. Be nice to the person who's out there mowing the lawn.
Right.
They're your friend. They know where everything is.
Yeah.
But anyway, so this Nick Beef thing, finally in 2013, the New York Times interviewed him. They tracked him down. And Nick Beef is actually the stage name for this guy who's, he describes himself as a non-performing performance artist. And he grew up in Texas. He was deeply affected by the assassination of JFK. And his mom, for some reason, would often take them to visit Oswald's grave. And she didn't really say why. So for him, it was just this weird, it felt meaningful for him. He discovered that, oh, that plot is empty. He bought it, and he put that marker there. And the funniest thing of all is that when he dies, he plans to be cremated, and he doesn't even want to be buried there. So that's always going to be empty.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. Does he intend to be interred there after he dies? But you just answered that. He doesn't. That's very odd.
I know. It's just odd all the way around.
If you had to look around the country and pick a cemetery that you have not visited that you really want to, what makes your list?
Oh, wow. Well, if there's somebody there or an interesting grave makes my list, I'm really fascinated. I would like to go to Mount Auburn Cemetery. And that's the first garden cemetery in America. And a lot of people listening have probably heard of Père Lachaise in Paris, which I've never been to. But this was the first time, it was Mount Auburn on the East Coast was patterned after Père Lachaise because they wanted to create a place where people could go and it would be out of town. The bodies wouldn't be in town. And it was like a park. It was America's first parks where actually there's cemeteries is what I'm stumbling around here and saying. We're the garden cemeteries. Nowadays we don't expect to have people buried in our parks, but when public parks were first created, they were created as these garden cemeteries. So people would go there on the weekends. They would have carriage rides. They would set up their easels and paint. It was for recreation and to see and be seen, as well as to visit your ancestors' graves. But it was also they were laid out in such a way as to create stunning views, to commune with nature, to also appreciate the sculpture, to be like a sculpture garden. So yeah, they were really quite interesting. So I would like to see some of those, and some of them have actually achieved arboretum status because the plants there are, antique plants. They're plants that you can't get elsewhere. So I think that is one of the importance of historic cemeteries is they actually preserve trees and plants that are historic.
Do celebrity graves interest you at all? I mean, I know there are people that make careers out of pointing out and giving tours to celebrity graves, particularly around Hollywood. Does that interest you at all?
Oh, yeah, that does.
Probably not as much as an alien grave or two men that were chained together. I mean, those are far more interesting stories for sure.
Yeah, I'm not so much into the fact that, okay, this person was well known and they have a listing on IMDb or something. To me, it's like they should make a movie about this person. This person should be a character in a book. We should know about Maureen Johnson. I'd watch a show about her. I'd watch a show about those two guys who killed each other over the drink and got chained together. I mean, I would. I kind of write these thinking, yeah, these should be made and hit the silver screen. So, yeah, I like the famous ones, but there's a lot of should-be famous ones that I want to find.
Do you know, and maybe you've even visited the grave, is Buddy Holly buried in Texas? He was from Texas.
He is. He's in Lubbock, and he's on my Texas to-do list. There are a lot of them that didn't make the book. In fact, I do see this as being part of a series. I would like to do one that's just all focused on maybe unique animal graves from around America. So if people know, because I know some really interesting stories. I know about a jazz-era monkey that's buried in a restaurant courtyard in Florida, that this monkey actually got an engraved invitation to the Scopes monkey trial, things like that. I think there are a lot more stories to be told.
The people who may be thinking to themselves, well, I'd love to go, look at whether it's any of these we've talked about tonight, Tui, or just, go to their local cemetery and walk through and appreciate it. What do you recommend that they do to make sure, A, they're not disrespectful in any way, but what should they be looking for to really appreciate what they're looking at?
Oh, well, yeah, and I usually do. I didn't in this book, but in my cemetery symbols, I have a safety and etiquette section because I think a lot of us feel uncomfortable in cemeteries and don't quite know what to do. But I'll put that aside and say that I would say, definitely, if I show up to a more modern cemetery and I see someone who appears to be mourning or there's a service in process, and I want to get some EVPs. I don't whip out a K2 meter. If you're doing I just leave and come back. There's other cemeteries to go to, but I highly recommend going to findagrave.com. That is such a wonderful resource, and you could find out. It's a really great stepping stone. I have their app on my phone because when I'm on a road trip, I look, are there any cemeteries near me? And then and it'll tell me.
What's it called again?
It's called Find a Grave.
Find a Grave.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes, that's a really wonderful website. I would say that's a really good starting point. I bet a lot of people are already going there, but who are listeners. But yeah, I would really say that's a great resource, and you can just find out, start your resource there. And then when you're walking through the cemetery, just look for the names. Like we were talking at the very beginning of our conversation, just follow your feet, and if a name calls to you, do a little research on it when you get home.
So that's how you do it. You if you see a name that you think, that's some reason that connects to me, and I want to check it out. You just go back and just Google it, or is there another source?
Well, I use a lot of. I have some free newspaper archives as well as some paid newspaper archives. Some librarians I know have kind of given me access to some neat ones that are just for Texas. But there are some. The name escapes me. There is this man. I think it's called the Fulton, New York postcards. I'm blanking. It is such a wonderful old Fulton, New York postcards. FultonHistory.com. This person has taken it upon themselves to scan as many newspapers and magazines as they can, and you can find some really obscure articles through there. So you could, type in a date and a name, and before you know it, you get lost. You'll be having to set a timer like I do because research. It's great. You think you're researching one thing, and it just escalates.
Wow. What's your next project, Tui? What are you doing next?
Well, I always have several going. I'm like one of those people who juggles plates. I have a humorous dementia caregivers guide or a memoir, I should say, from when I had was for few years here. I was a full-time caretaker for my father-in-law who had dementia, and we had a lot of funny moments together. But I never intended to write it as a book. But every time he said something funny, I wrote it down. But also, of course, the 1897 airship mystery, I have just got to. That one is high on the list because it's just, okay, I just have to get that one out. I have so much research, and I really want to share it with people. So I've always got several projects going. I do love writing books.
I'm just reading our chat here. It appears that one of our chatters, Jean, in our YouTube chat, says she's a volunteer with the Find a Grave site. Okay.
Oh,
awesome.
Wow.
That's terrific.
She's my hero. I love that. That is such a great site.
Where can people find, whether it's this book, which, again, is 6 Feet Under Texas, or any of the other ones that you have published?
Yeah, 6 Feet Under. Amazon is a really great place if they want to find my books. And a really good place to go would be, also since we're all on YouTube right now, or a lot of us are, I do have a YouTube channel, and I love to share research there. So that's a good spot. But my books are all available on Amazon. You can find them there and just dig in.
Well, it's been terrific having you back on the program, too. I love your work. I find it fascinating, and the way you bring these stories to life makes it extra special.
Well, thank you so much. It's really fun talking to you, and I've enjoyed your chatting with your listeners a little bit there during the break.
Look forward to having you back again at some point.
Beyond Reality Paranormal is hosted by JV Johnson and produced by Orion Palmer and Slick Eddie Edwards. Like us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please consider supporting the program either through your podcast platform, click on the link in the description, or on Patreon at Joha Productions. If you'd like to be a guest on Beyond Reality Paranormal, or you have a recommendation for a guest, contact our producer, Slick Eddie Edwards. Eddie is spelled with a Y at slickeddieedwards@gmail.com.